समझ नहीं आ रहा अपने सैलरी इंक्रीमेंट का क्या करूं।
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स के एसआईपी का टॉप अप करा ले। दिस इज द राइट टाइम।
क्या समझ में नहीं आया?
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स का एसआईपी टॉपअप करा ले। दिस इज द राइट टाइम।
अब समझा।
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme-related documents carefully.
Hello and welcome to a fresh new episode of Geopolitics with Swasti, where Swasti Rao, our consulting editor for international and strategic affairs, takes your questions, dear subscribers, on geopolitical developments around the world. So, Swasti, we will begin today with a question by our subscriber Ronak.
But we must say that we are having an episode after a long time.
A long
Devdatta, we
time.
missed you. She was ground reporting from Nepal, where you see a lot of GenZ protests happening. So welcome back to Delhi, Devdatta.
Thank you. Today we start with a question by Ronak, who says that can there ever be an India-Israel pact like there was a Saudi-Pakistan defense pact recently?
Now, that's an interesting question, and I've had my own views on it. And I think a lot has been said about it already. I mean, in fact, if today you were to open any Indian newspaper, you would see that there would be at least 2 or 3 op-eds which are having something to say on how should India make sense of the Saudi-Pak defense pact and how should India respond. These are certain reasons that come in the way of it. Our multi-alignment in the region, our ties, our independent ties with Iran, which I told you why they are important, our independent position on Gaza and Palestine. And third, because we would also like to have our ties with UAE, Saudi Arabia and Qatar. And many of those actually stand on their own. So from India's perspective, we do not want to look at the region in terms of a binary. Okay, it does not serve our interest to look at that region in terms of a binary. We have genuine interest with Israel. We have genuine interest with others. Now, despite that, I am with you if you were to argue that our multi-alignment in the Middle Eastern theater is not an equal distribution. I agree. Okay, there are certain interests that are more important for us in the short term, the certain interests more important to us in the long term. To come back to how should then India respond? Now, for that, actually, I have done a very long thread on my Twitter account. And I said that basically what we need to see, there is no doubt about the fact that Pakistan has been able to sort of diplomatically make itself more relevant today. Pakistan's army, which has been their major, so to say, instrument of their statecraft, okay, has been able to entrench itself in the diplomatic imagination of countries like US, countries like Turkey, China, Middle Easterns, Qatar, so on and so forth, okay. Now, what should India do? Now, the only thing that I can add is that India should be able to first tell the substance from the signal. You know, please understand that this security pact, okay, is not coming out of the blue. Pakistan has had deep security ties with countries in the region for a long time. These are countries which have been traditionally dependent on the US as a security guarantor, and just as US is retreating from that space, and not completely, so that retreat is also not simple, that retreat is also very, very checkered. So in one aspect you see that US is not wanting to sort of have troops on the ground. In the other respect you see that the same US under Donald Trump administration that talks about MAGA and making America great again has actually gone to the extent of an unprecedented support to Israel by actually deploying the B-2 bombers, which has never happened in the history of America. So what I'm trying to say is that US's retreat as an important security guarantor from the region is also not simple and straightforward. It is also coming in bits and pieces and spurts. In this current scenario, it is true that US is no longer the most important relevant partner there, because there is also an inroads made by China. There are also inroads made by Turkey, because there is a whole lot of power dynamics which are at play. Now, in that particular complex situation, Pakistan has been able to successfully make itself entrenched when it comes to human resource, when it comes to, providing engineers, when it comes to providing pilots, when it comes to providing mercenaries, etc., to many armies in the Middle East. The Qatar-Pakistan thing is well known. the pilots for Qatari aircraft, particularly the Rafales and Mirages, are all Pakistanis, by the way. Similarly, Pakistan has been developing the Turkish fifth generation Khan project, which is a fifth generation fighter aircraft, and 150 Pakistani engineers are doing it. So this is nothing new, but what has happened is that it has come at a time when Pakistan has been able to step up its diplomatic engagement. Now, what should India do? As far as the nuclear umbrella part of it is concerned, it has got more to do with signaling. That's not the substance, Let me tell you why. In my opinion, the more I talk and work with scholars from that region and scholars that have been working on Pakistan's defense industry with respect to Turkey, with respect to Middle East, with respect to Saudi Arabia and Israel, the more I speak to scholars from that region, the more I understand clearly that Pakistan has been able to successfully project itself as the revolving door in the defense industry cooperation, because we are discussing defense here, between China, between Turkey, between Middle East, and between Caucasus. And that is something which is the real substance that we need to basically study better. So we have a situation where there is an inflow and outflow of intelligence through joint exercises. There is an inflow and outflow of lot of other maneuvers and maneuver capabilities through Pakistani human resource being there. There is a lot of inflow and outflow of, for example, subsystems integration, because Pakistan has been able to co-produce jets with China that now it is exporting to third countries, which has different missiles, which have Turkish missiles, for example. So long and short, what you have to keep in mind that the Middle Eastern theater is a complex theater. In this particular segment, when you see that Pakistan and Saudi Arabia have been able to do a pact, of course it is signaling to the US, it is signaling to Iran, it is signaling to Israel, but it is also signaling to India, because this is just coming after Operation Sindoor. So India should be, first of all, more objective, and India should study how exactly and how deep is the Pakistani outreach in the defense industry ecosystem of these countries. Because as US is retreating, my larger point, that vacuum is not filled by one country. So you don't see that US's retreat as a security provider is being usurped by one country like Russia or one country like China. No, what you see coming in that place is a cross-cutting defense value chains, where you see that these countries do not want to put all their eggs in one basket. They would rather take one technology and go for subsystems integration, while at the same time keeping their ties with the US intact. And also remember, just as we are talking about all this, at the recent United Nations General Assembly, where you heard all these wonderful speeches by everybody, in the same venue, I think it was just a couple of days ago, when United States had its own meeting with almost all the Middle Eastern powers, including Turkey, including Pakistan, on the defense situation there. So US is there, but US is a half-hearted player. And you see a certain kind of a, support for Israel. But at the same time, Donald Trump has also said that if Israel is planning to take a West Bank, then they will not allow for it,
Right.
So the situation is very murky.
So, see, based on that, can you give us a few more examples of the subsystem integration?
Now, subsystem integration, one example I gave you, right? Chinese-Pakistan jets, which are co-produced in Pakistan, are being exported to Azerbaijan with Turkish missiles. Maybe more subsystem integration that I can make you understand is from our own theater about, how Chinese were instrumental in extending the ranges of the PL-15 missiles that the Pakistanis were using against India. And based on what we saw from the Victory Day parade in China recently, was that the Chinese have not only learned the lessons from Operation Sindoor, but also incorporated those lessons from Operation Sindoor, because they've already, that was the first time it was battle tested. Right. So you see that there is a kind of a seamlessness when it comes to these subsystems, which are not like big platforms, but subsystems that one country is facilitating in the deployment of another platform in another country. And it is, in some ways, it is still not as huge as big aircrafts, but at the same time, it is very much changing the defense value chains scenario of the Middle Eastern region. And that is why I call it a cross-cutting of defense value chains in the era of data leakage and tech leakage.
And Swasti, since we are discussing Israel, Gaza, and the Middle East in details, I will follow up with a question by a subscriber, Japnoor Kaur, who says that How then does the formal Palestinian recognition by US and others impact India's stance on Palestine? And what is now India's foreign policy when it comes to Gaza?
India's foreign policy on Gaza and Palestine has always been, I think, more of lip service, frankly, now, today, because principal stand from Indian side has always been a kind of a proclivity towards the Palestinian cause, and this goes back to the 70s. I'm sure I don't want to get into the history of it, but what we have seen happening now and lately is that Israel has become more relevant to India's strategic interests. Okay, and we do see that at a time when India is trying to diversify away from its arms dependence on Russia. So currently, our arms imports from Russia stand at about 36%. The other factors that have grown, the other countries that have grown in that space are basically France, US, and Israel. And Israel has also been very, very steady. So even though we basically get bombs and rifles and missiles and drones from Israel, but you do see that in a very short period, it has really grown by leaps and bounds. So long and short is that India will always have a principled stand. I mean, I only just now gave you an example of where India voted when it was about the resolution tabled by France. But long and short, I just want to tell you a couple of things. Okay, India, like I said, is going to multi-align in the region. India should multi-align in the region. In fact, my argument is that India should actually more successfully compartmentalize its foreign policy in that region. Okay, so India should not be restrained by one country or one interest there. India should be able to more successfully, compartmentalize. The other country that very successfully compartmentalizes its foreign policy in that region is Turkey. And not just in that region, but also globally is Turkey. So Turkey is also another country that has excellent ties with, not excellent, but at least good enough ties with Russia, good enough ties with Europe. Of course, they're very, very important for Europe right now. They're a NATO country, despite having all the problems with Donald Trump in the first term, when Donald Trump, threw them out of the F-35 program. Now, probably it seems that they're going to be back. If Donald Trump has two loves of his life, it is one on the one hand, Bibi Netanyahu, on the other hand, it's Erdogan. Okay. So what I'm trying to say is that what we have to see is that how is it that these countries and their leaders have been able to maximize their leverage. Okay. And that happens when you keep your foreign policy as compartmentalized. In the case of Turkey here, of course, I'm discussing Turkey. So my argument is that India should be better at sort of compartmentalizing its foreign policy, number one. Number two, in terms of Gaza and Palestine, of course, India supports a two-state solution. In my opinion, it looks like a very kitabi thing right now. It sounds very formal because in practice, it doesn't really mean anything. And this is something that I would allude to when I was speaking to Barak Senior, Dr. Barak Senior. And Barak Senior, I did a worldview with him. In fact, I think Ravi Rules has a question on that as well. Now, the reason why I picked Barak Senior is because not a lot of people here know that Barak is actually very close to Bibi Netanyahu. And he's actually considered in the London circles, he's considered Bibi's man in London. So one of the reasons why I spoke to him, because he's an academic, of course, why I spoke to him was because I wanted to understand what is it that Israel is thinking. Okay, and obviously the one way to do that is to actually speak to people who are close to that establishment and its foreign policy decisions. So Barak Senior has been very unequivocal when he says that, listen, the European countries may go to the extent of recognizing Palestine. It does not change anything on the ground, because on the ground you have to understand that even among the Middle Eastern countries, and I can totally allude to that because I've spoken not to one but to at least 10 different top-notch scholars who are working in the region, collecting data from the ground, speaking to everybody from Gaza to West Bank to Israel and so on and so forth, and all the Shia militants, etc. So that is the source, okay, that I can actually tell you without taking names, of course, is that it is true that even the Middle Eastern countries, although they are extremely pissed off about the extent to which Israel went when it struck Qatar, okay, when they were targeting the Hamas leaders who were living in Qatar, hiding in Qatar or whatever. But the fact of the matter is that the Middle Eastern countries, particularly the Gulf countries, are also wanting Israel to do the dirty job of actually containing the proxies. So while on the one hand they feel very pissed off and they feel very belittled about the audacity that Israel has shown, which is violating Qatar's sovereignty, and their anger is justified, but on the other hand, there is a tacit agreement that no one else is going to do this job. Remember that even in the case of Israel-Iran direct conflict, you don't see anything coming out from them except lip service. When it is about Gaza, you see nothing coming out from them except lip service. This time around, things have taken a completely different spin because Israel went to the extent of violating Qatar's sovereignty, and really sort of entered the Qatari airspace and struck, those targets. But the fact of the matter is that in fact, what you see in Qatar is also not the final leg. Israel is now going to go after the remaining Shia militants and the proxies in Iraq. And I have already written, an opinion piece on that Iraq could be one of the final chapters of how far Israel wants to shift it before it comes to Iran and finally wants to topple the regime, in whatever way. We'll see how it unfolds. But long and short is that when it comes to India, India will keep having this very, how do I say, anodyne kind of a position. Should it be more vocal is a different thing, is a political call to take. I myself am extremely critical of Israel's barbarous activity, especially on children in Gaza. It's like there is no way under the sun that I could justify it. But at the same time, I justify Israel's right to exist as an independent state. And insofar as how the matters have escalated right now, BP Netanyahu very clearly is looking to leave a legacy. So he is not going to stop. And as long as he has America's backing and unconditional backing, like we saw in the case of Donald Trump, we also see that there is very little room for maneuver for others. So the others are going to keep quiet. They are going to do their lip service. They are going to recognize and say that, the normalization with Israel cannot happen. Maybe that is going to take its own time, which means bad news for us because IMEC, I don't know where IMEC goes. I don't know where I2U2 goes because all of that was building on normalization. So the things are going to get a lot worse before they're going to, before they get better. From India's perspective, we do not see anything more than what we are already doing, which is support for a two-state solution on the one hand, and on the other hand, compartmentalizing our foreign policy with the Gulf states on the one hand, with more energy deals with them on one hand, with more strategic and military deals with Israel on the other hand, and Iran, and so on and so forth.
Swasti, taking it forward, since we did mention your worldview with Barack Senior, our subscriber Ravi Rules actually has follow-up questions, and he has a lot of questions, so I'll just club them all together. And his main point is that what is the situation about the strategic realignment in the Middle East, one, and second is, like we already discussed, that what is the future of IMEC then and I2U2?
So IMEC and I2U2, I already told you, they are, right now, they are more a pipe dream than anything. We have to wait for the normalization to happen because, for example, in I2U2, India, Israel and US are fine. But what about UAE? Is UAE has been extremely critical of Israel's action. So that's about I2U2. It's a strategic quadrilateral. Second is IMEC. I mean, how do you actually foresee a situation where the situation in the Middle East is going to achieve peace, quote unquote, anytime soon? And without that, how do you actually find companies or private investors that are willing to come and invest in that region? Because remember, the capital required for IMEC is not going to come from governments. The capital required for IMEC is going to come from the private sector. And for that, it has to be de-risked. The capital de-risking has to happen. Tell me how does it happen? So apart from the fact that IMEC had so many of its own problems about different logistics, but because of the situation in the Middle East, frankly, to my mind, it is right now not working. India should not wait for the Middle Eastern situation to normalize. India should cultivate more strategic gateways into Europe because ultimately the task of IMEC was connecting India to Europe via Middle East. Okay, and whenever the time is more conducive, we can perhaps connect and plug those developments along with the Middle Eastern developments, but it is not going to happen the manner in which we conceived in the G20 2023 presidency. The second thing that I have told you a lot about the strategic realignment, a couple of big characteristics emerging in the Middle East from my perspective. Iran is weakened. There is no doubt about the fact that Iran is weakened, and Israel has gone to every length possible to weaken Iran as well as its proxies. Now, in this situation, what we see that whenever there is a next round of a direct confrontation between Israel and Iran, which is also going to happen according to my assessment, we will see that China is going to play a bigger role than Russia because Russia is going to be involved more in the war in Ukraine. We don't see the war in Ukraine ending at all. In fact, recently Trump has completely shifted his rhetoric on Ukraine, going to the extent of calling Russia a paper tiger, etc. That what kind of a military it is that it is not able to win a war, which is it was supposed to win in 3 days or 5 days. So we will see that when the next round of the Iran Israel direct confrontation happens, China is going to play a bigger role, and that is something that I can say with a lot of confidence. As far as Russia is concerned, Russia is going to retain some part of its relevance. In fact, you do see that Iran and Russia have recently signed a civil nuclear cooperation, but that frankly means little in the larger strategic picture, because remember that Middle East was a theater where Russia had an active base in Syria, in Tartus and in Khmeimim, and now as Russia is dependent more on the war in Ukraine in terms of its capabilities being preoccupied there. So you do see that in terms of the larger strategic linking, you do see that the Russian base in Syria was its logistic support to Ukraine in the Black Sea against its war in Ukraine. And you do see a weakening of it. So to argue that Russia is going to play a big role, I think what suits Russia's perspectives best is that Russia should try to retain some or the other foothold. And Russia has done that by the civil nuclear cooperation with Iran. And I think it is a good enough thing, but not enough to emerge as a major security provider. We will see China playing a big role there. That's number one. Number two, we will see that US is going to retreat as the sole security guarantor. And in that place, we do not see one country or two countries usurping that place. But I already told you about a very, cross-cutting defense value chains. I also told you that, where you will see more and more subsystems integration. And third, that I can tell you is that whatever is happening in the Middle Eastern region, which actually weakens Iran and its proxies, is going to strengthen Turkey.
With that, Swasti, moving to the other part of the world, our subscriber Narendra Arya has a question on Serbia, where he says that the Serbian president in his address to the UN Assembly raised his concern for Serbs suffering under Kosovo. What is happening there, and why are these pockets not discussed much?
No, that's a very interesting question, refreshing question. I always like it when geopolitics goes to these theaters. Now, very quickly, I'm sure you know a bit of a background, which is that when you look at the Balkans, Serbia is actually in the Western Balkans. Balkans and Caucasus. These were the two frozen conflicts in Europe before the Ukraine war even started. Now, in the Caucasus, there has been a normalization process going on. We will see how long and how far it goes, which is between Armenia and Azerbaijan. Okay. But Western Balkans is something which is still unresolved. And this question that you asked me, all these countries, Serbia, Montenegro, Albania, Kosovo, Bosnia-Herzegovina, Macedonia, all these countries, Slovenia, Croatia, all these countries were part of the erstwhile Yugoslavia. And Yugoslavia started to go through a 10-year-long Balkanization process, which means disintegration process, where all these countries started to become independent countries because they had ethnic tensions, they had, religious tensions, etc. So far, there has been a problem with two parts. There are two parts which are still not completely settled in the disintegration of Yugoslavia. While most of the other countries have already become independent, they join EU, most of them join EU and NATO, but there are problems. So there is a problem between Serbia and Kosovo. If you look at the map, you will see how is Kosovo entrenched into the Serbian theater. And remember that when this disintegration was happening, Serbia was supported by Russia, okay, and the rest of the countries were supported by West and NATO. In fact, the 1999 infamous NATO bombing of Serbian army happened also in this context, when Serbia was actually bombing Kosovo, and Kosovo, wanted, and the West said that the only way to protect the Kosovars is by basically then bombing the Serbian, and that actually is referred to as one of the infamous incidents of NATO's intervention. Okay. Now coming to the present day. Now what has happened in the present day is that in 2008, Kosovo declared unilaterally its independence from Serbia. Okay, because there is, of course, the population composition is also different. Kosovars are basically mostly Christians and Muslims. Kosovar Albanians, Kosovar Christians, etc. Serbia is largely Serb. Okay, so now long and short is that then Serbia said that we do not recognize this independence, and ever since there have been tensions. Now, when you talk about Vučić, who is the president of Serbia for many years now, I think he first became president in 2017. Now, this is a very interesting scenario, right? The status of Kosovo is not settled. Serbia is one country in the heartland of that Western Balkans which is pro-Russia. So it is supported by Russia always. But Vučić is playing all sides. So ever since Vučić has come, Vučić has started integration with the EU. So just see how interesting it is. According to Vučić, the national goal of the Serbian nation is integration with the EU. So EU accession, right? It is true that when you look at the real development on the ground, it is not at all satisfactory, which means that अभी तो दिल्ली दूर है उनके लिए, which means that EU accession नहीं हो रहा. But in terms of their national goal, it is EU accession. Despite that, they have foreign policy differences because they don't want to support EU when it comes to Ukraine. Why? Not just because of Russia. Now, it is true that Russia has been supporting Serbia a lot of times because Serbia is the only sort of say that the bastion that Russia has in the Western Balkans. The rest of the countries have all fallen into the EU NATO fold, right? Now, long and short is that when you look at Serbia, it is interesting. Almost 20% of the Serbs today are committed Russophiles, okay? But the 50% majority would say that they would want to remain non-aligned. They would not want to join any security alliance. They would want to have good ties with EU. They would want to have good ties with Russia. And they would want to have good ties with China. In fact, recently when Xi Jinping went to Europe, okay, I think it was last year, Hungary and Serbia were countries that he chose to visit. And for obvious reasons, okay? So Serbia today is a country where, and Vučić is having a lot of authoritarian tendencies. So as usual, the students, the educated class within Serbia is against him. Okay, so for handling that, Vučić has done two things, which is that every time there is more crackdown, okay, inside Serbia, he always says that internationally the situation is problematic. So Kosovars जो हैं वो हमें मार रहे हैं. Then the second thing, something recently happened which was very, very interesting, that Kosovo, Albania and Croatia, and look at the map so you see where it is, Kosovo, Albania and Croatia entered into a military agreement. Serbia said that they are doing it against me. They said that no, we are not doing it against you. But at the same time, this basically shows that there is rising tensions. The same Vučić that keeps saying that we have a problem with Kosovo, of course there is a problem with Kosovo. The same Vučić now you see is using ties with EU, using ties with China, using ties with Russia, and at the same time, Serbia is one country that has deep defense relations with France. France actually is France's decision of selling Rafales to Serbia has been heavily criticized in the French parliament because they say that Russians will have access to the electronic warfare system. Similarly, not many people know that Serbia is one of the most important defense partners of a country like Israel. So when Israel started, after Hamas attack, Serbia was one of the most important country to actually export a lot of ammunition to Israel, and Israel has been also sending them a lot of military equipment, right, from missiles and a lot of other things. So long and short, what you see in the Western Balkans today is an unfinished project of Yugoslav balkanization. And also there is a problem with respect to statehood. The emotions run very, very deep and very, very high at the same time, and you have in the middle of all this, Vučić, who is trying to maximize his leverage with everybody, but the problem for him is that in that process, what he has done in the eyes of his own public is that he has delegitimized himself.
Moving on from Serbia, Swasti, our subscriber Anjali Das has a question on Venezuela. And she asks that what is happening in Venezuela, and do you think that it will become another showdown for the US-China rivalry there?
Interesting question again, and to be very honest, I've been planning to actually get the Venezuelan ambassador to India to come and do a discussion with me to basically better understand their position. But I have done an explainer on Venezuela, so you please feel free to see it. I'll put a link in the description box for you to understand what is happening there. Ever since Donald Trump has come back, in fact, even in his first term, he had been very vocal about the drug cartels, and he had been very, very critical of Nicolas Maduro's regime in Venezuela, and he says that he's basically not a regime, he's a drug trafficker, and he has his own cartel, and there has been a lot of fentanyl, etc., and those kind of drugs are basically coming into US from those regions. And what he has done to just cut a long story short, because you will get a lot of background if you were to see my explainer on the same, but what has happened is that US has deployed heavy military and equipment, also a lot of ships and warships and stuff like that, and all that in the Caribbean, and to basically ramp up pressure on Venezuela Venezuela and Nicolas Maduro's regime. Now, the interesting bit is because you've mentioned that whether it is a defeat for China, or do you see a kind of a great power contestation between China and the US playing out in the theater. Now, very quickly, I'd just like to rectify a few things for you, which is that this is not the same. I mean, China has supported Maduro's regime, it's true, but because the neighbors themselves do not support Maduro, for example, a key member of the BRICS, Brazil, blocked Venezuela's entry into the BRICS. So, China understands that Maduro's regime is disliked by a lot of neighbors. This is not just a completely anti-US picture. Brazil dislikes them, Argentina, Brazil, a lot of the Bolivia, a lot of these countries in the region actually dislike, Maduro's regime. And China wants to keep out of it. So in case there is a military intervention by the United States, which looks more and more probable as days go by, we will see Russia not doing anything. We will see China not doing anything. There will be a lot of criticism and this and that. But I honestly don't think Donald Trump really gives a damn about all this.
And Swasti, we have a question on what is happening, what happened recently in Russia and between Russia and Poland. And you were there in Poland. I remember you did a CTC with Shekhar sir. This is a question by our subscriber Indranuj, who asks that what do you think is behind Russia's aggressive attack on Poland, which is actually a NATO state? And Narendra Arya follows up on that and asks that do you think it was not actually Russia but Ukraine that hacked into the country's drones to attack Poland and get NATO involved?
Yeah, a lot of theories are doing the rounds. Yes, I was indeed in Poland on that very day. In fact, I'd reached Poland a day ago, and on that day, of course, when I got up in the morning, so these things happened at night. These drones incursions happened at night, and when I got up in the morning, the entire strategic, mahal had completely changed because there was they had closed down the major airports, etc. So please do see that CTC also that I did with Shekhar from there. That's one. The other thing is about Russia. Why is Russia doing it? So let's talk about this one theory first and we come to the other theory of Ukraine doing it later. So see, Russia has done it earlier. The East European flank has been a very volatile flank because while NATO has conventionally it is much more superior than Russia in terms of conventional capabilities. But when it comes to tackling hybrid threats, we see that NATO is not very prepared. And this has not happened for the first time. This has happened many times, in the recent past, and especially after the Russia-Ukraine war has started, you do see that hybrid attacks from the Russian side have increased. So whether it's cyber attacks, whether it's, damage to undersea cables. For example, we keep hearing about Nord Stream, but there is also another one in the Finland-Estonian waters, which is called the Baltic Connector pipeline, which was also damaged. And later on, when they went into the details, they saw that it was perhaps a Russian ship, but it all had Chinese crew on it, etc. So you do see that there is a rise of that. There's a rise of, a lot of hybrid attacks from that side. And Russia has flown drones into NATO territory. Russia has flown jets into NATO territory. So you're asking about Poland. Days after that, just 10 days after that, there were Russian jets actually violating the Estonian space. Between Poland and Estonia, between these cases, there is a case where Russian drones entered the Romanian space. So they're all NATO countries, right? So that is why your theory of perhaps Ukraine doing it doesn't really qualify, because had it been a one-off thing, you could probably still have these conjectures, but because this is a repeated thing, right, and there are signatures that are found. Why is Russia doing it? Russia is doing it because it wants to, of course, show that NATO is not prepared. Russia wants to test how far the NATO countries are going to go in order to really activate an Article 5, or do they keep doing Article 4 consultations? But if I have also done an explainer on this, which is that is NATO bluffing, okay, and has NATO already lost it, this war against Russia, something like that. So basically the argument is in 2015, Russia did the same in the Turkey-Syria border, and Turkey had shot down those jets. But the situation had become extremely volatile because one miscalculation can truly bring the world to the brink of a third world war, because then those states are frontline states, okay? So long and short is that the situation is bad. And the most important key takeaway that I can tell you right now is that we will see a lot of doubling down, especially on the eastern flank of NATO states, of the realization that their conventional capabilities are not enough to really tackle this drone threat, okay? Jet threat is different, but the drone threat. And for that, you will see a lot more agreements happening between those states and Ukraine, because Ukraine is the one that pioneers the drone technology. So you will see and a lot of that has already happened. So Poland has already signed a very major deal with Ukraine on drone capabilities, because it doesn't make any sense for you to take down drones by using expensive fighter jets and missiles, right?
Right.
So that is where it is going. So yeah, I mean, again, a lot of destabilization, but we are living in very uncertain and volatile times.
And with that, Swasti, we come back to South Asia, and a lot of questions on Nepal. I've clubbed them together, and one is Anubhav Saxena asking whether the deep state is involved in Nepal. Ashish Dev Singh is asking, how do you view it, because it is the third country in South Asia after Sri Lanka and Bangladesh to have an unrest. Anjali Das wants to know if there is a risk of infiltration due to porous borders between the two countries, and what can the Indian Gen Z learn from the Nepalese. And Noor Ahmed asks a final question, which is, what is the level of public support for China?
Now, that's a whole lot of questions. And let me just begin by answering that I have not been to Nepal myself to cover those protests. Like, for example, I keep going to Ukraine, I keep going to Poland, I keep traveling, across Middle East. So I know that region well. But when it comes to Nepal, I only can give you my own assessment, which is that I think this is a genuine protest because the youth of the country are very, very angry against long-standing corruption, etc. That's my assessment. But you know who's the right person to answer this question? That's Dev Datta. Because Dev Datta has spent 2 weeks in Nepal. So Dev Datta, please tell us, do you think that this is something which is done by the deep state? I don't know whose deep state, but perhaps some deep state. Or do you have another view on it?
Swasti, I don't really think there's any kind of deep state involved here. And I would also like to, on that note, point it out that this conjecture of the deep state being involved in protest movements across South Asia, reflects very badly on the Indian media as well, because then there's a lot of resentment against the Indian media, because if you go to talk to them on ground, this is the first thing that they say, that, it is, they view it as kind of robbing their agency away from them when you say that, they didn't do anything. It was perhaps some bigger player who had a role to play in this. So if you go by my assessment, I don't think there's any kind of deep state involved. Like you said, which is absolutely correct, which is the sentiment on ground, that there's a lot of pent-up anger and rage against the old ruling guards, the traditional elites who run the 3 major parties in the country, and there is a massive unemployment. I have even done a story on this. If you talk to people on the streets, if you talk to traders, if you talk to people our age, everybody is either preparing to go out of the country or they have someone who is already out of the country. And it's not that they are, laborers or workers. It is also the educated elite, the literate class that actually wants to move out of the country because they feel that the country lacks opportunities.
See, there is a reason when we say that our neighborhood policy doesn't work, okay? Now, let's take a moment and think about it. Our neighborhood policy doesn't work because every single time we see a people's unrest in our neighborhood, we are the first person to say that, oh, it's not them, it's somebody else.
Exactly.
And that big brother attitude, that condescending attitude is really hated in the neighborhood.
Absolutely.
So whether if something happening in Bangladesh, remember how many Indians are convinced that this is a deep state, American deep state thing. So you don't want to give the Bangladeshis a agency and legitimacy that unke gusse ka bhi koi matlab hai. Same in Nepal, So for the first thing that we need to change when it comes to our neighborhood is that we have to learn to accord agency and understand why is it that they carry a resentment towards India. So long and short is that if we want to understand a conflict, no matter where it is happening in the world, we have to first learn to accord the people that are getting affected by that conflict agency and listen to what is it that they have to say for us to develop an understanding on it. And then comes the political part as to what we want to do, whether we want to remain neutral, whether we want to do something is a second layer. The first layer is, are we able to understand what is happening on the ground?
On that note also, I remember someone asked a question on what is the public sentiment on China. And despite...
Noor Ahmed has asked this question.
And despite the fact that, they have so much resentment and they hold so much of a anger towards the Indian media, they actually look forward to ties with Indians more than the Chinese. I know that KP Oli had a specific China bent, but when I talk to politicians and experts there, they all look forward to the fact that now India-Nepal relations, when it comes to trade, when it comes to, because the social structure, many Nepalis still consider the country to be a Hindu state. So they, they look to India for more collaboration because there's also a Gorkha regiment in the military.
Absolutely, yeah.
And on that note, Swasti, we come to an end of this episode. We do look forward to your questions for our next episode and stay tuned for more.